born in Bucharest, Romania in 1940. He is a child survivor of the Holocaust and is our keynote speaker tonight. He is accompanied by Gidon Kowalski. Benjamin Hirsch, born in Frankfurt am Main, Germany in 1932. He was a witness to the events of Kristallnacht. He and his 4 older siblings survived because his mother was able to arrange for them to travel to Paris on a Kindertransport. He is accompanied by Lior Granach. Sam Silviger, born in Oświęcim, Poland in October 1923, he is a survivor of 16 different labor and concentration camps and later fought in Rubin in the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. He is accompanied by Idan Nir. Penina Bowman, born in Cluj, Romania in 1927. She is a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. She is accompanied by Jade Novitz and Hannah Shapiro. Murray Lynn, born in Hungary in 1928. He is a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. He is accompanied by Karen Videlefsky. Henry Bernbury, born in Dortmund, Germany in 1923. He managed to escape Germany in 1938 and later went back to Europe as a US Army liberator. He is accompanied by his granddaughter, Abby Stein. Ruth Gross and her husband, Bernard Gross. Ruth was born in Palanok, Czechoslovakia, and is a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Bernard Gross, born in Palanok, Czechoslovakia in 1922. In 1943, he managed to survive by jumping from a moving cattle car that was bound for Auschwitz. They are accompanied by Emily Lehner and Leora Isakov. Manuela Mendels-Bornstein, born in Paris in 1933. She narrowly escaped deportation and survived with the help of the French resistance, who helped move her family to the unoccupied region of southern France. She is accompanied by Sophia Videlefsky. Lucy Carson, born in Antwerp, Belgium, was hidden in France during the war in the town of Vic and in various OSE homes during the war. Lucy is accompanied by Erin Kowalski. Regine Rosenfelter, also born in Antwerp, Belgium, was hidden in France in the town of Vic and in various OSE homes during the war. She's accompanied by Ivana Videlefsky. Regine's sister, Susie Tibor, born in Antwerp, Belgium, was also hidden in France in the town of Vic during the war. She is accompanied by Ari and Gabby Stark. Sonia Dubois. Sonia is a child survivor of the Holocaust. She was born in Rotterdam, Holland in 1940 and was hidden by a foster Dutch family in Schieda. She is accompanied by Talia Kowalski. Miriam Fishkin, born in Krujany, Poland in November 1930, and is a survivor of the Holocaust in Siberia. She is accompanied by Aaron Gordon. Ben Klein is a child survivor of the Holocaust who was born in The Hague, Holland in 1940. He is accompanied by Ethan Arbiser. Rabbi Resnick, born in Prague, Czechoslovakia in 1929, transported to Mogilev, Transnistria work camp ghetto. He managed to escape and spent the final 6 months of the war fighting with the partisans. Ben Klein will now recite for the first time publicly a poem that he has written about the Holocaust. At the end of the poem, please stand in silence and we will observe the official Holocaust Memorial Siren from Yom HaShoah 2013 in Israel.
The final journey. The hour was late. We finally fell asleep with major trepidations because we heard the trains within the station. And in the middle of the night, we heard the pounding on our door. We rose to barking men and growling dogs. We were herded in the night. We had no shoes. Our only clothes, the things that we wore to sleep. We could not stop, for those that did were beaten. We were herded into trains and stuffed in cars where cattle stood the year before. A mother stuffed her baby through a tiny broken slat. The child was caught by unknown loving souls. What did the mother know or feel? What force compelled her to provide that final shove? As trains rolled slowly down the street, we could not fall. The cars were stuffed at full. Some slumped, just frozen where they stood. Their journey ended on the ride, for they had spent their final breath. But there were some who knew their fate that waited at the end. And when the ride was over, the train rolled to a stop. We heard again the barking men and growling dogs. The doors were wrangled open. We tumbled out of cars where cattle once had stood. The masses were assembled. They herded us in line. The old, the young, the weak in one, the strong, the attractive young, women forced into another. The question was to stay in line or try to switch, for one was death, the other death delayed. The line moved forward at a dreadful pace. Some man, no feeling in his face, observed the line of death delayed. He'd wave his hand, and with the ease of swatting at a fly, condemn another soul to die at once. The line moved slowly to its destination. We were told we need a shower. Our clothes removed, a piece of soap, that's strange, it feels like stone. We were forced into a room 250 at a time, and packed so tight no one could move. The door clanged shut, a noise is heard, the room is filled with smoke. The screams are loud, then slowly die as silence goes. The bodies fall. Then no more sound is heard. The gas removed, it's safe, for there are more to murder. And now the dead delayed are forced to do their job. The door is slowly opened, the bodies piled in heaps of bone and tangled flesh. The weakest on the bottom, the strongest fell on top, and some still stand, propped up by those that fell before. The bodies now removed, the valuables are plundered, the useful must be saved, tattoos turned into lampshades, gold tooth as saved for booty, hair turned into rugs. The bodies now assembled, piled high in ovens made for bread. Their souls look on in horror, the mother and the children, the old and all the weak. The fire soon ignited, it's ashes that remain. The world is told but chooses not to listen, as screams ring out, the innocent are slaughtered.
Welcome everybody to our 6th annual Yisrael High program. remembering the Holocaust, but taking it beyond and speaking about survival and success. These are stories of suffering, but also of resilience and success. I now call on Rabbi Yossi, head of Chabad of Georgia, and Chief Rabbi of Congregation Beth Tefillah, to give us a Dvar Torah.
The loss of all human life is tragic, but that of a child, as we saw again in the tragedy in Boston earlier this week, adds a dimension to that tragedy. Innocence destroyed and potential lost. Conversely, when a human life is saved, it is a cause of great celebration. And when it's that of a child, again, it adds a dimension. Innocence restored and the opportunity for potential to be developed. Whenever God speaks to the Jewish people, the Torah states, Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel. God always speaks to the child within every one of us, the child that represents innocence and potential for growth. And so tonight, as we recall those who gave up their lives and those children who were miraculously saved, let us all reflect upon the child within ourselves and make a commitment that in this crazy world where there is so much that challenges and potentially destroys innocence, that within our own homes and in our own lives we'll preserve that innocence and purity for life, and like a child, make a commitment to always challenge ourselves to grow morally, spiritually, and educationally. Have a very inspirational and meaningful evening. Yisrael. Thank you.
As Rabbi, you said, we still have to continue, we have to live, we have to go on, we have to uphold our spirit, and hence our title, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel lives. We've defied many attempts at our destruction, and on our Passover Haggadah we say, in every generation there are those who will rise up against us to destroy us, and the Almighty with a strong hand and outstretched arm will redeem us. And it's also with our fellow human beings, and we hear many stories of survival that have elements of power and grace from our fellow men, whether they're Jew or Gentile. And I think we're all one, and we all experience the horrors of the Holocaust, regardless of who we are. And we need to remember it only as we go forward to make a difference and let this kind of thing never happen again. Also, the Holocaust, in some strange way, led to the establishment of the State of Israel. And there is a wonderful program called March of the Living, where high school students go to the killing fields of Poland and see the concentration camps firsthand, and then they go to Israel. They walk the March of Death that occurred during the Holocaust, and now it's called the March of the Living, and then they celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut in Israel. And we have the great pleasure of inviting one of the students who went on this march last year, Ethan Arbiser, to come and tell us about his experience. Ethan?
Last spring, I had the opportunity during the month of April to embark on an experience which would permanently change me in ways I cannot imagine. I, the grandson of the survivors of the Shoah, went on the March of the Living, traveling with teenagers from around the world from varied Jewish backgrounds to Poland and Israel. The experiences my grandparents were about to become real. During these 2 weeks, I experienced an emotional roller coaster. From visiting many of the notorious death camps in Poland to visiting the Kotel and celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut in Israel. I and my fellow Jews underwent an emotional aliyah. My experience on this trip were very difficult to describe. I, like many others, have a personal connection to the Shoah. My grandparents and their families were victims. It is difficult, without standing in the places of the Holocaust, to fully understand what had happened. I knew that my family had been dehumanized and murdered in these places, but now I really felt it. I even visited the street where my grandfather grew up. Many other participants shared the similar stories of anti-Semitism that predated the Holocaust. I'm lucky. I studied in a modern Orthodox Jewish high school. At Yeshiva Atlanta, I'm taught Jewish history. I thought I knew almost everything that there was to know about the Holocaust. I had learned the stories and statistics, seen many photos, read the stories, and had met survivors who had vividly recalled the horrors of living in Nazi Europe, but I was wrong. 6 million. This was a familiar number, and the program always seemed to emphasize 6 million. But the truth is, 6 million is incomprehensible. I thought this was an exaggeration until I visited camps like Majdanek, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. The first stop was a train station in Lodz, where as a group we said the daily mincha prayer in the count car. For myself and others, this mincha was an everlasting symbol of strength, courage, existence for the Jewish people. To think that this was an item used for extermination of our people, and now we are thanking God for the life in that same car that carried so many to their deaths, left a deep impression. The Auschwitz Museum is well preserved with many graphic items displayed. The mounds of hair, piles of shoes were overwhelming. It was not until I arrived at Birkenau that the enormity of the Shoah hit me. Birkenau was gigantic and easily comparable to a small city. Stretching as wide as 1 mile, just walking through the camp was tough. I was left wondering how the town of Auschwitz could have been blind to what was happening. The town, maybe half a mile away, where people were being continued with their day, while hundreds of thousands of their European brothers and sisters were enslaved, brutalized, and killed. As I was struggling with this, one of Elie Wiesel's famous responses popped into my head. When he was asked, where was God during the Holocaust? He responded, where was man during the Holocaust? At Treblinka, although the camp was destroyed, there were still human remnants on the campgrounds. This camp was where my great-grandparents were burned in the ovens. In gas chambers, the distinct blue stains of Zyklon B and less obvious scratch marks on the concrete walls stand as testaments of the many people whose last struggle for human life occurred where I stood. This was very painful for me. During these intense emotional moments, which were occurring daily, I thought about my family. I wasn't homesick, yet I yearned for their presence. I wondered, what would I have done in this situation? What would my parents' reaction be? And where would I be without my family? Marching from Auschwitz to Birkenau alongside 8,000 Jews from around the world was life-changing. There was an endless sight of blue that occupied the road to Birkenau. I found it amazing that thousands of Jews could still express their pride in a place where so much death occurred. We left Poland with all of our memories, and like some of the survivors, headed to Israel to celebrate the country we can all call home. In Israel, we commemorated the fallen soldiers in our sister city of Yokneam. This is tough for many because some of the soldiers were only a few years older than I was when they were killed. The next day, together, we celebrated Yom HaAtzmaut. In Israel, we danced and sang at a concert right in Jerusalem and walked to the Kotel. Here I realized that Jewish life continued to thrive even after the tragedies occurred in the Holocaust. I'm very thankful for the March of the Living for giving me the opportunity to fully understand the Holocaust and to be a part of the Jewish revival. I'm very thankful to be one of the 8,000 who got to experience a glimpse of the Holocaust while being a part of the Jewish people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ethan. Ethan represents our future and the important thing of remembering the Holocaust, but not dwelling in it, just learning from it and moving on. We mentioned the children, and if you recall, in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, when the Pharaoh wanted to subjugate and destroy the Jewish people, he decreed that all the male children should be thrown into the sea, into the Nile. And I think the parallel in Nazi Germany was the same, where the war that Hitler declared had two fronts. One was the battlefields against powers of European countries, and the other was against the Jews. Last year we were able to quote Beth, who was a Holocaust survivor. Her daughter Anne Birnbaum is a member of our community, and she said, "We survived, we won the war, I have children, I have grandchildren, and we will continue. Am Yisrael Chai." I'd like to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Andrea Kessler, who is a child survivor from Romania. And I'm not going to say any more because he's going to say it much better than I ever could.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. It's an honor to be here. I was born in Bucharest, Romania in March of 1940, and my name at that time was Andrea Grunfeld. Romania was an interesting country. It took her until 2004 to admit that she was responsible for the murder of between 280,000 and 380,000 Jews and over 11,000 Gypsies or Romas. I owe my life to two very special people. One of them happens to be my mother of blessed memory, who was a very stubborn lady. When the decree came out for the Jews of Romania to sew the yellow star of David upon their clothing, she refused. She didn't sew it onto hers or onto mine. Well, it was a crime that was punishable by death. If the patrols would have stopped us, questioned us, and found out we were Jewish, they most likely would have murdered me in front of her eyes and then murdered her. But we were fortunate in the fact that my mother did not look like the typical stereotypical Jew. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. The other person I owe my life to fits into the category of what we now call a righteous Gentile. George Popescu was the custodian of the apartment building where my parents lived in Bucharest, and when my father was arrested in December of 1942, he and my mother decided we should go into hiding. The area where we lived in was declared a no-live zone because it was very close to the King's Palace and the Parliament building, so the buildings were abandoned. One of the few things that the Romanians did was they confiscated all radios and telephones from Jews. Romania did not have a extermination camp, but she had a concentration camp called Transnistria. In case you didn't notice, because I'm sitting down, I'm fairly large. I'm 6'5", and these days I'm 100-some-odd pounds. Well, my father was also a large man when he was arrested. He was 6'4", and he weighed 246 pounds. When he came back in August of 1945, he was still 6'4", but he weighed 132 pounds. They almost literally worked him to death. He dug ditches, shoveled snow, worked on bomb repairs, anything that the Romanian Iron Guard under Nazi supervision found for him to do, he did, and for that his reward was a bowl of watery soup a day and a piece of bread that was mainly made of sawdust. My mother and I went into hiding in our own apartment. The windows were darkened, blankets and sheets had been shoved under the door so no sound would come out, and that's where I spent the next 16 months of my life, was in that apartment. Food was a non-existent luxury. The staple food of Romania is a cornmeal-based concoction called mamaliga, and that's what I ate when we could get it. My mother, of course, we didn't have a calendar, but she had a pretty good idea in her head what day it was. When Georgia Popescu would come and bring us food, she asked him what day it was. And when in her mind, when it was Shabbat, we didn't have candles, but we had kitchen matches. So she lit a kitchen match and said the prayer over the candles. When she thought it was Passover and we couldn't have matzah, she would sit me down and tell me the story of the Exodus. So I had Jewish training even when I was 3.5 and 4 years old. My parents came from the section of Romania that prior to 1918 had been Austria-Hungary. During the First World War, Romania was on the side of the Allies, so at the 1919 Versailles Peace Treaty, she got a very large section of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire known as Transylvania. And that's my grandparents, aunts, uncles, and lots of cousins left. And when I tell you lots of cousins, my mother was one of 6 children. My father was one of 13. So I should have bunches of first cousins. Well, I don't. In 1944, when a man by the name of Adolf Eichmann came up with the final solution for the Hungarian Jews, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, and most of those cousins were rounded up, sealed into cattle cars, and shipped to the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp in Poland. My grandfather never made it to Auschwitz. When he and my grandmother were arrested, they were put into separate cattle cars. He raised such a ruckus that the Hungarian Arrow Cross guards opened the cattle car he was in, took him out, beat him to death, and threw his body in with my grandmother. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what happened when you got to Auschwitz. You heard Ben Klein tell the poem about the lines, the selections. Well, one of the lines was the most notorious of the SS doctors who did the selection at Auschwitz was a name by Joseph Mengele. Dr. Mengele was known as the angel of death at Auschwitz. He was obsessed with genetics. He wanted to see how he could produce multiple births in German women. So if you were a twin when you got off the train, or you had any kind of an unusual deformity, you were taken to his laboratory and experimentation was conducted upon you. My great uncle, Professor Dr. Hermann Kessler of Budapest, Hungary, was one of the Jewish doctors who was forced to work with Dr. Mengele. When my uncle was well into his 80s, I sat with him in his apartment in Budapest and I tape recorded him. When I asked him why, he said he wanted the world to know what he had witnessed. The tape, it's now on a DVD, is at the United States Memorial Museum in Holocaust in Washington, D.C. When I started to speak about 36 years ago, I always said that I lost 80% of my family in these camps. Nice number, what does it mean? I really had no idea what 80% of my family was until my mother was down here visiting from New York and HBO happened to be showing the Simon Wiesenthal story, The Murderers Amongst Us. In case you don't remember or recall who Simon Wiesenthal was, because we lost him in September of 2005, Simon Wiesenthal had survived 5 death camps. And at the end of the war, he made it his life's ambition to help track down escaped Nazi war criminals. He is credited with helping to track down Adolf Eichmann, the man I told you about before in South America, but is also credited with helping to track down the Austrian policeman Karl Silberbauer, who is believed to have arrested Anne Frank and her sister Margot, and then they both perished in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp 2 weeks before the camp was liberated. And in that movie, Mr. Wiesenthal's daughter asks him why they don't have a lot of family, why they don't have aunts and uncles and grandparents. And he explains to her that they lost over 70 members of their family during the Holocaust. And I glance over at my mother, and she's no longer watching the movie. And I said, Mama, what are you doing? And she says, I'm counting. I said, what are you counting? She said, well, he said 70. She says, I can only recall 120. And that's when it came into clear proportion to me what 80% of my family was, 120 human beings who had been murdered in these camps. Well, the war is over. My father comes home, and we try to pick up some semblance of normalcy. I got sent to school. I got put in the first grade, but I had a problem. I didn't know how to associate with other children because I had spent 16 months of my life in that apartment. So when a child said something I didn't like, I either hit or I bit. Well, I got over that. In 1947, Romania became a communist dictatorship. My father owned 2 men's shirt factories, and one morning the Romanian government came to him and said, the factories you own have now been nationalized. You will still run them, but you will no longer own them. Well, I told you my mother was stubborn. My father was not to be outdone. He arranged for my mother and I to escape across 2 borders. We went from Romania into Hungary, Hungary into Austria. When we got to the Romanian-Hungarian border, and the people who knew where the gaps in the barbed wire were, and when it was a good night to cross, saw that I was an 8-year-old boy, they panicked. They were afraid I would make a noise and give them away. So in addition to whatever money my father had paid them, and there was nothing wrong with that because they risked their lives to do this, my mother took off the jewelry she was wearing and gave it to them, so they decided it was okay to take the risk. To this day, I still remember the sounds of the guards, the smell of their cigarette smoke, and the barking of the dogs. As we were walking across the fields in Hungary, my mother stepped into a pothole and severely sprained her ankle. So when we got to Budapest, we had to go to what was called a safe house, and I was right back in the apartment. Don't make any noise, don't draw attention to yourself, don't speak to anyone. In about a 3 to 4 week period, my mother's ankle healed. We went to the Hungarian-Austrian border, crossed over, and just as we were getting ready to board a bus to go into Vienna, we were arrested by the Austrian police. Luckily, it was the Austrians, because if it would have been the Russians, we would have been sent straight back to Bucharest. When we explained to them that we were so-called political refugees, they put us on the bus and sent us into Vienna. My parents had arranged for a telephone conversation, and when my mother said a certain key word to my father, he knew we were safe in Vienna. He had gotten a hold of some explosives. He planted them on a timer. He went across the border, and in the morning when the Romanians went to look for their factories, all they found was rubble. He had blown them up. Every once in a while, almost on a daily basis, my lovely wife says to me, "You're so doggone stubborn." I said, "Yes, I am. I get it legitimately. I come from 2 very stubborn people." Well, here we are in Austria of the late 40s and early 50s. Austria was also an interesting country. For years, they claimed that they were a conquered nation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Adolf Hitler was not German. He was Austrian. And it's come out that Austrian Jews had to pay what was called a flight tax. They had to pay for their own deportation. And one of the most notorious of the extermination camps was out outside of Linz, Austria, known as Mauthausen. So much for the myth that Austria was a conquered nation. We are very fortunate that in this country we live in the freest society in the world. But Austria of the late 40s and 50s was not that way. You had to have an identity card. This was issued to me, and as much as I speak, you'd think I would know it by now. The 4th day of the 10th month of the 50th year. I was 10 years old. Every time I show it, it amazes me. It's in 4 languages. It's in German, English, French, and the bottom part is Russian. And it says that this is an identity card for foreigners and stateless persons. That's what I had become. It's a terrible thing for a 10-year-old boy to be either a foreigner or a stateless person. And by the way, they just didn't give this to us, whatever meager funds we had, you had to pay for it. So if the police stopped you, you produced your identity card. I had my picture inside. Cute kid, wasn't I? Had hair and everything. Amazing. So this was Austria of the late 40s and 50s. When we got there, they told us it would be at least 3 to 5 years before we could even think about coming to the United States because there was an immigration quota. My father had 2 brothers who had gone to France prior to the Second World War. As liberal as Romania was in the 20s and 30s, when my Uncle Janos wanted to go to medical school, he was declined. He had a quota that would only take so many Jews, so he went to France and got his medical degree from the Sorbonne. He sent for one of his younger brothers, and during the Second World War, both my uncles were with the French resistance. One of them as a doctor, the other one as a fighter. My uncle Emery despised the Nazis so much that he was such a fierce fighter that at the end of the war, he was decorated for bravery by Charles de Gaulle. So it was a lot easier to get to France than it was to come to the United States. My parents decided that my father would go join his brothers, and whoever was able to support the other one would join them. Well, I wound up not seeing my father again for 13 years. In March of 1951, my mother and I got permission to come to the United States. We left Vienna and went to Bremerhaven, Germany, where the ships sailed from. But they only sailed 1 a week, so I wound up in what was called a displaced persons camp. It was an old German army camp. I don't know if they didn't want us to associate with the Germans associate with us, but for the first time in my life, I was behind barbed wire. August the 7th, 1951, my mother and I boarded a very small former troop ship, the SS General Sturgis, and an amazing thing happened. The ship had 2 sections. It had a man section and it had a woman section, and since I was a really big kid at 11, they didn't think I belonged in with the women, so they put me in with the men. At first, it was very traumatic. It was the first time in my life I was separated from my mother. But then I learned that food was plentiful aboard ship. I could eat as much as I wanted to, when I wanted to. And since my mother spent the 10 days it took to cross in her bunk because she was terribly seasick, I had my first taste of freedom. I roamed the ship. It had very low railings. I was always hanging over the side, afraid I was going to fall overboard, but it was my first taste of freedom. We landed in New York City, August 17th, 1951. Well, the law in New York is that the day after Labor Day, you have to start school. They put me in the 6th grade, but I had another problem. I didn't speak any English. I spoke 4 other languages, but English was not one of them. They didn't have help for foreign students in those days. If you kept up fine, if you didn't, the teacher didn't have time to occupy himself or herself with you because there were 50 kids in my homeroom class alone. Luckily, I have a very good ear for languages, so within an 8th month or 1 year period, I had a working knowledge of English. I had an accent you could cut with a knife, but I had a working knowledge of English. Now, I'm not condoning the next part of my speech, nor am I apologizing for it, it's just the way things happen. The neighborhood we lived in was not the very best. I learned how to defend myself very early and very well. When I felt like going to school, I did. When I didn't feel like going to school, I didn't. When the letters started to come to telling my mother I was truant, at first I explained to her that there were letters of commendation about how well I was learning English. Well, I got away with that until she started to learn English. Ladies and gentlemen, my mother was a tiny lady, but she had a left hook that would knock out a mule. So most of the time, I tried to stay out of her way. I also learned what social promotions were. You see, I was a very good athlete in school. I played 5 sports. I played basketball, baseball, soccer, track, and something that they would not even dare to have today. I was on a rifle team. They gave us 22 caliber rifles and we went out and target shot. The only time I was not allowed to participate in sports was Shabbat. From Friday night to Saturday night, I was not allowed to participate. We went to synagogue. I had my training at Young Israel of Sunnyside, and when I was 13 years old, I had my bar mitzvah. I was called up to the Torah on a Saturday morning. I said my Torah, and afterwards, my mother had a bottle of wine and 2 sponge cakes in the back of the synagogue, and that was my bar mitzvah. About 2 weeks before I was ready to graduate high school, I got into some serious trouble. I was taken in front of a judge, and I was given 2 choices. Either enlist in the military or go to jail. Well, I didn't know what the military was all about, but I had a pretty good idea what jail was all about. So I was escorted from the judge's chambers to the Navy recruiting station in the same building. It could have been any branch of the service, but the judge happened to be in the Navy during the Second World War. So that very afternoon, I was on my way to Great Lakes, Illinois for basic training. I eventually became a Navy hospital corpsman, and I was a medic. And I even got to spend time with the Marine Corps at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, because the Marines don't have their own medical personnel. And lucky me, I wound up with a branch of the Marines that required you to jump out of an airplane. Well, I want you to know it's not a natural act to jump out of a perfectly good airplane, but that's what I wound up doing. It's amazing, when I reunited with my cousin Yaakov, who lives in the kibbutz Yagur in Israel, I discovered that he was also an Israeli paratrooper in the IDF. So I guess you have to be a bissel meshuggah to be in my family, but it doesn't hurt. When my time in the Navy was up, I was given an athletic scholarship to New York University. I played basketball for NYU. And you know, several years ago, the University of Georgia and several other colleges across the country decided that their athletes should actually attend classes. What a novel idea. Well, my coach, Lou Rossini, insisted that we go to classes, and it wasn't knitting 1 and basket weaving 2. I have a degree in business administration from New York University. When I graduated from NYU in 1963, I was drafted by the Philadelphia Warriors, now Golden State of the National Basketball Association, and I played 2 years of professional basketball. Now, I know you never heard of me, but I know you heard of my roommate. His name was Wilt Chamberlain. The traveling secretary thought he was very clever to put the Jewish kid and the black kid together, thinking that it was an insult to both of us. Well, the big guy and I became very close friends. Unfortunately, we lost him all too soon at the age of 69. The NBA I played in was not the NBA of today. It was still a predominantly white league. There were only 10 teams in the entire league. The furthest west we went was Minneapolis, Minnesota, because it was the Minneapolis Lakers, not the Los Angeles Lakers. And some of the cities we went to followed the Jim Crow laws. The black players on our team was not allowed to stay in the same hotels that we stayed in. To show what we thought of that, some of us stayed in their hotels. And then we were arrested for civil disobedience by the police. So when it came time to play basketball, the traveling secretary had to bail us out of jail so we could play. Well, Coach Rossini must have been prophetic. My knees gave out. I retired. I came down to Atlanta in 1965. I'm married to the former Marcia Tenenbaum of Savannah, Georgia. We have 2 children. Our daughter is 36. She attended Georgia Southern University in Statesboro. She got married 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, Marcia, whatever it was. My son-in-law, purely by coincidence, is also an ex-Navy corpsman, so I tease her that she married her father. She doesn't think it's funny. They have 2 little boys. Our grandson, Benjamin, is a little over 2 years old. And January the 10th, we had another grandson by name Joseph. Our son is 34. He attended University of Georgia. and then got his master's in public health and risk management from Emory. He got married 7 years ago. Our daughter-in-law Lindsay is from California. She's also an Emory grad. They have 2 boys. Our grandson Samuel is going to be going to kindergarten this fall. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I get confused with the grandkids. What do you want from them? They have 1 boy named Samuel who's going to be going to kindergarten this fall. And then 8 weeks ago, we had our princess. Jordan is 8 weeks old. You may say to yourself, why is he telling me all of this? 3 years ago, at our synagogue at B'nai Torah, we had a visiting dignitary. And I was there, my son was there, and my grandson Samuel was there. And Rabbi Heller walked up to me and said, Andrea, what do you think the odds were in 1943 and 1944 that would be 3 generations of Kessler men standing here tonight? And I looked at him and said, Rabbi, the odds were slim and none. I'm sure that most of you have an advantage over me, that you're computer literate. You can get into computers easily. Well, I can't. I still threaten to throw mine out the window every other day because I get frustrated. But if you get into your computers, you'll find over 60 sites that deny that the Holocaust ever happened. And then there's this wonderful man over there in Iran, and bear with me because I love to say his name. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who says there was no such thing as the Holocaust. To show you how smart he is, he even volunteered to be launched into space by the Iranian space program. I sincerely hope that it's a one-way trip. When he spoke at Columbia University in September of 2007, he was informed by the president of Columbia that the Holocaust is one of the most documented events in human history. In 2009, President Barack Obama visited the Buchenwald concentration camp, and he was accompanied by poet laureate Elie Wiesel, because that's where Mr. Wiesel was liberated from. And President Obama said the following: to this day, there are those who insist the Holocaust never happened. This place, and he's referring to Buchenwald, is the ultimate rebuke of such thoughts, a reminder of our duty to confront those who would tell lies about our history. Stick that in your water pipe, Mr. Ahmadinejad, and smoke it. After the war was over, Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower visited the Dachau concentration camp. And he found victims of the death camps. He ordered all possible photographs to be taken, and for the German people from the surrounding villages to be ushered through the camps and even made to bury the dead. And why did he do that? Because the people around there said, we didn't know. It wasn't us. It was Hitler and Himmler and Goebbels and Goering. Well, let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. I visited Dachau in 1961. The camp was liberated in 1945. 16 years after the camp was liberated, when you got within a 2-kilometer radius of the camp, you could still smell the camp. General Eisenhower continued. He says, get it all on record now. Get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the track of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened. It happened. If you can't deny the Holocaust, you might as well try to demean it. There's this wonderful organization out there, and before I tell you their name, let me just tell you that my wife and I have had dogs most of our married life. We rescued another one 9 years ago from the Golden Retriever Rescue Society. Our daughter and son-in-law have 3 dogs, and our son and daughter-in-law have 1. But this wonderful organization known as PETA, the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, have a campaign going around the country comparing the suffering of livestock to that of the victims of the Holocaust. Unbelievable. Even now, 60 some odd years, 69 years after the end of the Holocaust, there's evidence coming out that it existed. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel visited Berlin, and he was given an original blueprint of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. And in the corner of the blueprint were the initials HH, Heinrich Himmler, head of the Gestapo. 4 years ago, in Auschwitz, in the town of, they were renovating the school. And in the wall of the school, they found a bottle with 6 signatures of inmates of Auschwitz. One of them was a French Jew, the rest were Polish Christians. The French Jew, his name was Albert Yossi, and he has the number A12063 tattooed into his arm. They found him in Lyon, France, and he verified that indeed those were their signatures, because he said they wanted the world to know that at one time they had existed. I live in East Cobb County, Georgia. In 1996, in my subdivision and several subdivisions around us was left the following paraphernalia. They bought race mixers, if you want oil, nuke Israel, white power, and in order to fight crime, and I don't use that word, but I think you can see what it says, it's the N-word since the O.J. Simpson trial. On the back, it says, who is this man? He looks like an American, he dresses like an American, he speaks the same language as Americans. He goes into a whole bunch of diatribe. Who is this man? He's a Jew, don't trust him. 1996, East Cobb County, Georgia. 4 months ago, in Newnan, Georgia, residents woke up and found flyers on their lawn that said, sleep easy, we are on guard, signed by the Ku Klux Klan. Several years ago, the Southern Poverty Law Center did a survey, and they found that there are 762 active hate groups in the United States. Unbelievable. If you were to come down to the Rubin Museum, you would be given my biography. And we ask people to sign it. When we have school groups through there and other groups, we give them that of our speakers. Elie Wiesel says to hear a witness is to be a witness. Well, I am a witness. The sad part is that even today, in the Sudan section, in the Darfur section of the Sudan, there's a genocide going on. Over 500,000 are already dead, and over 3 million are refugees. And the world still stands by, deaf, dumb, and blind. Thank you.
Children were especially vulnerable during the Holocaust. The Nazis and their collaborators killed 1.5 million children. Children were among the first to be murdered when arriving at ghettos, mass graves, killing centers, and concentration camps. In spite of their vulnerability, many children found ways to survive. Children smuggled food and medicines into ghettos. Children participated in underground resistance activities. Some children were hidden in churches, orphanages, barns, and family homes. Some children formed close bonds with new families who righteously rescued them. Some children experienced the terror of being torn from these adopted families and learning to love and know parents who had survived but were psychologically scarred. Many children were never reunited, as none of their family members survived. The Kindertransport was a rescue effort that saved more than 10,000 children from Nazi tyranny and brought them to safety in Great Britain, France, and the USA. These and many other stories are showcased in the incredible exhibit, and the posters of survivors from JFCS Child Holocaust Survivor Group on display tonight. We have so much to learn from these brave, courageous people. Thank you to each of the survivors here tonight. We have a moral obligation to listen, to hear, to see, to understand, and to learn from their stories of survival. We have a number of Holocaust survivor authors. Please be sure to stop by in the social hall where they will be signing their books. We also have Miracles and Meals, a book that highlights the stories, photographs, and recipes of Holocaust survivors available tonight. Thank you to each and every one of you for taking the time to come out tonight to participate in this event. Thank you for helping us plant daffodils as we aspire to plant 1.5 million daffodils in memory of the 1.5 million children who perished in the Holocaust. Each year, as the daffodils emerge from the darkness of winter, we remember each and every child whose life was cruelly cut short. To date, we have planted more than 27,000 daffodils. Over this past year, we planted 3,600 daffodils at the Bremen Jewish Heritage and Holocaust Museum, 5,000 daffodils at the Atlanta Botanical Garden, 5,000 daffodils at the Abe Besser Holocaust Memorial at the Marcus Jewish Community Center, 250 bulbs at the Kennesaw History and Holocaust Museum, 360 bulbs in Canada, and 200 bulbs at the AA Synagogue. We have more than 11,000 daffodils planted here at Congregation Beth Tefillah. We have set a goal to plant an additional 20,000 daffodils this year. With your support of tonight's event, together we will plant 7,000 of those daffodils in the worldwide Am Yisrael Chai Holocaust Memorial Garden. We also have Am Yisrael Chai Holocaust Remembrance bracelets available tonight. These bracelets exemplify the message of remembering those who perished and helping victims suffering in modern-day genocides. Wear your bracelet in good health as a tangible reminder of those who perished and of those who survived and succeeded. Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you.
Andrea, how many speeches a year do you give?
Too many to count, but I try to limit them to maybe like one a week. We are very fortunate that at the Bremen we have groups coming through almost every day of the week. We have not only survivors, but we also now have second and third generation involved. Unfortunately, we're losing our survivors. In the past 2 months, 3 months, we lost 2 of our survivors, our speakers down at the Bremen.
Do you know how many survivors are currently living in the United States?
No. A lot of people will not even admit to it.
Really?
Stan Lefko, who came up to say to me, his father used to speak, but his mother absolutely refused. She didn't want to go back there. My mother's cousin, my grandfather lived on this side of the street, his brother lived across the street, and they were transported to Auschwitz. She survived. She was 23, 24 years old. She worked in one of the factories, but she refused to talk about it. Every once in a while, she would throw me a bone, so to speak. That's when I learned that my father's cousin, Yaakov, wound up in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he perished in the Warsaw Ghetto, but he perished with a gun in his hand. And I hope he took a lot of them with him. So,
how long was it before you were able to speak about it yourself?
I didn't. I mean, I lived an American life. And then when we found the museum here in Atlanta, I didn't associate Atlanta, Georgia with Holocaust survivors. I associated New York and Miami and Skokie, Illinois and Los Angeles and so on. And one day I had a radio show here in Atlanta on Ring Radio. And I never got into the Holocaust, but one afternoon somehow or other I started talking about the Holocaust. And I got a phone call And I could tell from the man's accent that he was European, and it turned out to be Alex Gross. And he said to me, "You're ignorant." I said, "What else is new? I went to college on an athletic scholarship. What do you want?" He says, "We have a very large survivors community here in Atlanta. One of the first monuments to the Holocaust was at Greenwood Cemetery here in Atlanta, Georgia." And that's when I got involved. In 1996, when we opened the current museum with Ben Hirsch as the architect, and that's how I got involved. I was one of the second or third speakers at the museum.
You speak so beautifully about it now and so eloquently when you first started speaking about it, and you relive these moments in your head.
Hard. Every time I speak, it's like opening a scab on a wound. That's why when school year is over, she drags me away. We either go on a cruise, or we go up to the mountains, or we go to Savannah, to my brother-in-law's beach house, because I need to get away from it.
Thank you.
It's hard.
Thank you.